Well, welcome. I've been asked to record some thoughts about Christmas. I want to give you two talks. The first is historical, where it all started and where it all came from. And then in the second talk, we'll look at the Bible and the actual story of the birth of Christ and how all this fits together, or even whether it does fit together. As most of you probably know, Christmas is not a Christian festival. It began long before Jesus Christ was born. It was originally a pagan fertility cult, and it was a celebration of the winter solstice, the fact that the sun was just beginning to get stronger again. And they waited till the solstice was over on December 21st and then celebrated the sun's been born again and the spring is on its way again. Because, of course, they lived much closer to nature than we do, much more dependent on the seasons. Their food didn't come and stay in the refrigerator all the year round or the freezer. They had to depend on the seasons for their food. So this was a matter of celebration, especially during the cold, dark winter. It was good to have a carnival, which is what it really was. Now, it was mainly in Europe that this began, and in Northern Europe it was the festival of Yule, Y-U-L-E, the origin of the Yule log and Yule tide. For one of the central features of the celebration was a huge bonfire round which they kept warm. And for that end, they used to chop down a big tree and burn the trunk as the Yule log. And that bonfire with a big log in the middle was the center of the Yule celebration in Northern Europe. In Southern Europe, it was called the Saturnalia, after the god Saturn. The Romans celebrated Saturnalia and made a great deal of the sun god Mithras. So it was all a celebration of nature. It was part of a fertility cult, and fertility then was a very important feature. Fertility in the fields, fertility of the animals, and of the people. And so there was this annual carnival or festival, which I'm afraid developed into quite an indulgent festival, because the normal rules of life were cancelled for the festival. And it wasn't just one day, it was 12 days and lasted till January the 6th. Even today, I remember in our home, decorations had to be taken down on January the 6th, the 12th day. I had no idea why. I didn't then know about the 12 days of Christmas when my true love said to me. And of course, that is a clue to what went on. Normal restraints were removed, and all kinds of things happened as a result. For example, the normal rules of social relationships were cancelled. And therefore, one part of that was that there were no longer upper and lower classes over Christmas. And they often changed places. Indeed, masters would serve servants their meals on that day. And there's a survival of that in the British Army. It is still the custom at Sandhurst for the officers to serve the privates Christmas lunch. It's a reversal of the social order just for a time. But it was mainly in the realm of sexual relationships that the release came and restrictions were removed. And that is still seen in office parties. Kissing under the mistletoe goes right back to these festivals when they decorated their homes with evergreens like fir and holly, and above all mistletoe. all these evergreens were taken in and used to decorate the home. Putting a wreath of holly on your front door goes right back to those pre-Christian festivals. And one of the features was very amusing. In the carnival, they could dress up how they liked. And they reversed the sex of people dressing up. And so men dressed as women and women dressed as men. And we've still got that today. In every pantomime, the principal boy is a girl with the longest legs, and the mother of the principal boy is a dame who is a man. And that's a cross-dressing that goes right back to the carnivals of the original midwinter festival. There are more things than that I'd like to mention. It was a time of gluttony, when it didn't matter how much you ate. You could eat yourself under the table, and that was all right at Christmas. That still happens with Christmas dinner and the turkey and the plum pudding, when we eat far more than we normally eat for lunch. It's a relic of the old fertility festival. And the drinking too. You could drink as much as you like and drink yourself under the table too. And that too has survived. Again, at the office party or over Christmas, the pubs are full of people getting drunk. What else has survived? Well, the social rules are reversed, the sexual rules are reversed, the eating and drinking rules are set free, and interestingly enough, gambling, which was normally frowned on during the year, at Christmas you could really gamble as much as you liked. And that certainly has a modern counterpart in the money that is spent over Christmas, which leaves many people in debt to face the new year and pay off what they've had on credit over Christmas. So all these things go right back to those 12 days of Christmas. Many communities elected a lord of misrule who ruled over the 12 days and had the freedom of any woman in the community during those 12 days. And that's the origin of the 12 days of Christmas, when my true love said to me. So we have a very indulgent festival when people simply let go and could do what they wanted. It was a self-indulgent festival. But there was a good side, and that was that the rich were expected to help the poor over Christmas. The haves were concerned about the have-nots, and especially the poor and the lonely and the disabled were a special concern. And that was a good feature of the annual winter festival, and that has survived. Boxing Day is when the boxes in church were emptied for the poor, and the boxes were then used to distribute whatever had been put into them on Christmas Day to those who were needy on Boxing Day. Well, now, that's how it began. And it went an up and down sort of journey through the ages. I'll just mention one or two of the downs and one or two of the ups. During the Middle Ages, it wasn't particularly popular except among the aristocracy and the upper classes. Then it steadily declined over the centuries until the 19th century. And then Christmas as we know it really began. Not until the 19th century, when two authors wrote stories about Christmas. On this side of the Atlantic, it was Charles Dickens. And much of what we know as Christmas today, we owe to Charles Dickens. Not just his book, A Christmas Story, and Scrooge, and the turkey in that story, The turkeys came over from the States originally, but over there was also an author called Washington Irving, and he was the Charles Dickens of America. And so the modern Christmas developed both sides of the Atlantic in a kind of cross-fertilization and set off by these two authors. And their stories really raised interest. But I suppose the biggest factor over this side of the pond was Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert from Germany. And of course, our kings had a strong German taste about them, and they had already brought Christmas over. Some of our kings and queens were very keen on the celebration, the carnival aspect, the buffoonery aspect. Henry VIII celebrated. Elizabeth I was known to dance and gamble on Christmas Day. And right through the Stuart and the Tudor times, Christmas was celebrated, particularly by the royal family. But it was Victoria and Albert who focused on the family as the main celebrating unit, not the community, but the family. And they stamped family life on Britain. And it was Albert who introduced the Christmas tree to Britain. Germany being full of forests and a very tree country, he introduced the Christmas tree to the home as the main visible sign of Christmas. And during Victoria's reign, it became a very major part. Every family had to have a Christmas tree. And during the 19th century, someone thought of sending a Christmas card to your relatives and friends. And the card was relatively simple and cheap. The penny post became the halfpenny post for Christmas cards. And that difference between letters and card postal lasted quite a long time, right into our time. So these were a quick way, an easy way of greeting your relatives and friends. Instead of writing long letters, all you could do was sign a card and send it off for a halfpenny. And that really took off in the 19th century. So it is to that century that we really owe the modern Christmas. And in particular, a gentleman who was known on this side of the Atlantic as Father Christmas, but on the other side of the Atlantic, Santa Claus. And we'll find out where that came from. It came from Holland, because New York, in which Santa Claus first appeared, was a Dutch colony. It was not New York, it was called New Amsterdam. And in Holland, there was a strong emphasis on a saint from long ago called Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas was a man in Turkey and a bishop, and a very kind man, concerned for the poor. And there was in Turkey a father who had 3 daughters who had no chance of getting married, though they were good looking, because they didn't have any money for a dowry. And the bride was supposed to supply money, or the bride's father was supposed to provide the dowry, and the peasant couldn't. So good St. Nicholas smuggled some gold coins wrapped in a cloth into the cottage of the peasant. He didn't climb down the chimney, and he didn't put it in a stocking, but he wrapped these gold coins in a cloth and threw them through the window. And the 3 girls were able to get married. Now, this story really captured the Dutch imagination in Holland, and Saint Nicholas became almost their patron saint. They called him Santa Claus, which is short for St. Nicholas. And then in New York, Santa Claus, as we know him, was born and given red robes edged in white ermine and with hunting boots and a long white beard, and we had the Santa Claus that we know. And I remember when we had our little 3 children in Buckinghamshire, we took them out in the car one morning to go and see Santa Claus in a big shop. But on the way, we saw another Santa Claus getting on a bus. And we saw yet a third Santa Claus walking along the street. And I remember the confusion this led to with our 3 children. Santa Claus seemed to be everywhere we went that morning. And of course, he is everywhere now. He's part of Christmas. So all that happened in the 19th century. I'll tell you in a moment about the Christians who opposed it all quite strongly. But public sentiment was too strong for the protesters. I'll come back to that later. What has been added in the 20th century to all this? Well, there's no question the biggest thing is commercialism. And already now, we're recording this in October, and already the advertisements for Christmas are displayed on our TV, and the shops are beginning to take stock and stock up for Christmas and so on. And it's interesting that the bulk of the advertising is aimed at children. Very expensive toys too. But the advertising is aimed at children now. It's not now focused on family, but the 20th century has focused Christmas on children, which the Victorians did not do. Children could be seen but not heard then, but now children have become the focus of Christmas for many families. Another thing that's been added this time is what we call the Christmas broadcast of the Queen. It's become a ritual, and you can't imagine Christmas without it now. But it was begun by her grandfather, George V, and he made the first Christmas broadcast and quoted that memorable thing, "I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year," oh, I've almost forgotten it. But the reply of the man was, "Put your hand into the hand of God, and you can go into the future safely." I forgot the quotation, but it really struck a chord in the nation when King George V quoted that. And therefore, he went on making a radio broadcast every year. But his son, King George VI, stopped doing that because of his dreadful stammer. And I'm sure you've seen the film The King's Speech or heard of it, and you know all about that stammer. So he said, "I'm not going to make a broadcast every Christmas." However, in the first year of World War II, for the sake of the soldiers who were away from home, he was persuaded to make it. And he managed to do it, and he kept it up right through the war. So his daughter, our Queen, has to make the Queen's royal broadcast, usually just before Morecambe and Wise. But that's part of Christmas now, as is television entertainment. And it's interesting that all the mass media now cash in on Christmas. As early as, I think, 1900, the Times never mentioned Christmas in its December issues. But if you look at newspapers and magazines today, Christmas takes over for a time and becomes the main subject. So those are the historical features, none of which are Christian, of course, and all of which have so gripped the public sentiment that the thought of abolishing all that really horrifies the British public and the American public. Oh, one other 20th century addition to the mess is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer with his shiny nose. And that's become now such an important part of Christmas. So it's a funny mix. Well, now, let me just begin to look at how Christians have coped with this annual pagan fertility custom. In the first 4 centuries, good Christians ignored it. And they really were convinced that Christians should not be involved in such an indulgent thing. The carnival aspect particularly worried them. In the 4th century, Pope Gregory sent a missionary to England called Augustine, not the Augustine who wrote the Confessions, the other one. There was one in Africa, the one we know best, but another Augustine was sent to England. And he reported back a year or 2 later, he'd made progress, he'd baptized the King of Kent, he had a number of people coming to a church, which later became Canterbury Cathedral. But he said, I have not been able to wean the British off their annual fertility cult festival, namely Christmas, though it wasn't called that then. And try though he could his best, he could not get them off this indulgent activity. So he asked Pope Gregory, what can I do about it? And Pope Gregory virtually said, if you can't lick them, join them. But what he actually said was, baptize it into Christ, bring it into the church, and do it in the name of Christ. Furthermore, he suggested, as they celebrate the birth of the Son, you can say, we'll celebrate the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N, who is risen with healing in his wings. That's a quote from the Old Testament. And so December 25th became the official birthday of Jesus. Of course, it isn't anything of the kind. He wasn't born in December. Shepherds don't watch their flocks by night in December. There's often snow on the hills of Israel in December. And we're told in the Bible when he really was born, which was not anything like December. But just as the Queen has her own birthday and an official birthday when they have the parading of the color on the Horse Guard Square, so now Christ was given an official birthday, which was not his birthday, but was celebrated as such. And that was the profound beginning of a Christian Christmas. And what was included to make it especially Christian was a Roman Catholic Mass. And then the name Christ Mass came into being. And it's been known as that ever since. So this was the Roman Catholic Church's missionary strategy. If you couldn't get people to drop things, then bring them in and make them part of the church's program. And that will keep everybody happy. I'm not convinced about it at all, but in the Philippines, in Latin America, I've found that Catholics still practice animism and spiritism because that was their original religion, and the Catholic Church encouraged it to come in. And it's quite disturbing to find out how far these old things are still deeply rooted. So that was the beginning. And it was Pope Julius, following Pope Gregory, who made it an official institution of the whole church, though it was originally only for Britain, and to get the British to drop certain things. Over the medieval period, there was a steady decline of interest, but there's still a medieval feel about Christmas. Stagecoaches on Christmas cards and old thatched roofs, you've seen them all. There's a kind of nostalgia for the good old days. They weren't all that good, but nostalgia looks at them through rose-colored spectacles. Now, all that changed radically when the Protestant Reformation came. And my time has gone for this talk, so I'm going to have to pick up the story in my next talk. Well, now we've seen that in the medieval period, Christmas became an official Christian institution, and the church gave its full support. Significantly, much of the pagan practice of Christmas continued. Even as late as the 14th century, they were still electing lords of misrule to reign over the 12 days, so that we have a period during which the pagan customs and the Christian approval were molded together and continued side by side. With the Protestant Reformation, mainly Luther and Calvin, there came a big change. Luther struggled with anything Roman Catholic. And of course, Christmas was a Roman Catholic creation. He also struggled with the pagan roots of Christmas. Nevertheless, Martin Luther gave in, as most state churches did. Because when you're a state church, you regard yourself as including everybody. You pastor a country. And therefore the tendency in state churches is to keep public customs and sentiments. And so Luther did celebrate Christmas reluctantly, but especially he loved his guitar and singing songs and carols to the children. So he kept it. Calvin, on the other hand, in Geneva, did the opposite. And Calvin strongly opposed Christmas and Easter, because the Bible is opposed to festivals of any kind. The New Testament, Colossians 3, if you want to look it up. And so Calvin in Geneva wouldn't have anything to do with Christmas. And Calvinism, in the form of Presbyterianism, came to this country, but to Scotland, not so much to England. And the result is Scotland has no Christmas. They celebrate Hogmanay, or the New Year, but they don't celebrate Christmas. Presbyterians don't. They follow Calvin. And John Knox was Calvin's man in Scotland, and he persuaded the Scots to drop Christmas altogether, as did a later time when the Presbyterians nearly took over England as well as Scotland in the Civil War. And when Cromwell came to power and the royal family was abolished and King Charles has lost his head in a crisis, then what happened was that legally, Parliament in Britain abolished Christmas altogether. Of course, you can't abolish popular sentiment as easily as that. And in the country areas particularly, they kept up some celebration of Christmas. But officially, it was now abolished in England as well as Scotland. However, you know, the Civil War led to a Republican Britain with Cromwell as the first protector or head of it all, and it only lasted a few years. And the people wanted a king again, and they wanted Charles II back on the throne, and they got him back on the throne, and he reintroduced all the royal family's support of such carnival activity, and Christmas was back on the agenda. In the 19th century, as I told you earlier, the Christmas as we know it really came to be, with the trees and the decorations. And gradually, these things crept into the church towards the end of the 19th century. Until in the 20th, it was quite common for a church to have a Christmas tree right in the place of worship. I was amazed a few Christmases ago to find a Pentecostal church in which the church had a huge Christmas tree, and the church itself was decorated with Christmas streamers and so on. And so gradually the church has capitulated to the popular desire to go on celebrating Christmas. And indeed the churches began to cash in on it themselves. For example, they replaced the Christmas Mass on Christmas morning with Holy Communion on Christmas Eve, and found they got more taking bread and wine on Christmas Eve than at any other time during the year. And even evangelical churches today can put on a Christmas Eve communion. And churches put on carol services and sang carols instead of hymns. And so gradually churches gave in, and what has been called the cult of the crib began. And that was that churches should have a model crib with the baby Jesus in, and Joseph and Mary, and donkeys, and sometimes camels, and all sorts of creatures. And they used to make a big display of the crib and make it a place of devotion and veneration. And from there, the cult of the crib spread into society. And the nativity play was born, especially when children were expected to act out the story of the birth of Christ, leading to some very amusing situations. When you're trying to make little children act like adults, you can expect trouble. I think of one nativity play in a primary school where the three kings came on, and the first one said, "Here's some gold for the baby Jesus." The second one said, "Here's some myrrh for the baby Jesus." The third one said, "And Frank sent this," and presented the third gift to the baby Jesus. Another nativity play I recall where Mary and Joseph, Mary being great with cushion, arrived at the inn and said, "Is there room for the inn?" And little Joseph said, "You can see my wife is nearly ready to give birth to a child. We need a room." And the boy playing the landlord had forgotten his lines and said, "Come on in, you can have the best room in the house for Mary." And the whole thing was getting off course. Fortunately, the boy playing Joseph had great presence of mind, and he pushed his head in through the door and came back and said to Mary, "You should see the state of this inn. It's not fit for you. We'll be better off in the stable. Come on." And turned the whole play round again to the great delight of the parents watching. But the Christmas story is not for children, it's an adult story. The Bible was written for adult believers. Anyway, that's how Christians came to be involved. And this has led up to another crisis. In America, you had the churches deeply divided over Santa Claus and Christmas. On the one hand, the Presbyterians again from Calvin, and the Baptists and the Quakers together raised a howl of protest against churches accepting Christmas. And it's often from those quarters that we still have a protest. the mainline denominations tended to bring Christmas in. The free churches at first tended to keep it out, but most of them, Methodist Congregationals, gave way, and I have to say Baptist Salvation Army and even Pentecostals have given way and usually celebrate Christmas in some way or another, which raises the whole question of where are Christians today and what should be their attitude. And we have a choice before us, either to take it in and try and keep it somehow well behaved, or to reject it and not even try. Or to put the situation quite bluntly, either we can try and put Christ back in Christmas, or we can take him out of Christmas and let it go its own way as a pagan festival again. With Britain increasingly secularized and the second most godless society on earth, Japan being the first, according to a poll of the nations, that we are the second most godless nation on earth. That's not religious, just godless. And so we're up against a changing situation that if it goes on as it is, the trend is entirely towards a secular Christmas that has more in common with the pagan origin than with anything specifically Christian. I have to be honest with you, I'm in the second group, and I don't observe Christmas and I don't preach it. I talk about it, I'm talking about it now. But I believe the safer way is to free Christ from all that's come up around Christmas. And I'll tell you why I have come to that conclusion. It's a bit startling, but that Pentecostal church, which was in Croydon, where I preached at Christmas time, though I was horrified to see all the tree and the decorations right inside the church. And I did a thing that I've often done and asked the Lord questions. I call it interrogatory prayer. I hope you practice that. You've heard of intercessory prayer, where you pray for other people, but interrogatory prayer is when you ask the Lord questions and wait for an answer. I found that a very helpful form of prayer, but a very startling one when the answer comes. And in the middle of that service, I said, Lord, what do you feel about Christmas? And he reminded me that I had a photograph album at home, which was produced by my mother, who was a very keen amateur photographer. She used to win competitions. And this album is of me and my life, from a little baby right through to a boy. And when I show it to people, they say, oh, what a lovely baby. And I hate it. I want to say, I'm not a baby. You have to relate to me now as I am now, not as I was then. Much easier to relate to a baby. They don't answer back. You can coo over them and you pick them up and cuddle them, but they don't fight you. Not usually, anyway. So there was this album, and I had it at home. And I thought, why should the Lord remind me of that? And then I realized that he wanted to say to the people, I'm not a baby, not now. You have to relate to me as I am now, or it's not a real relationship. Now I realize that cooing over a crib is not a real relationship. because it's not with a real person, it's with a doll. And if you want to be related to Jesus now, you have to relate to him as he is, a full-grown man, with his character, what it is. And when all the world is so excited about a little crib with a doll in it, Jesus is saying, I'm not like that now. I want a relationship with you that's real, between you and me as I really am. And I shared that with the congregation, because it came to me as I sat there on the platform. The other thing that has had a big influence on my thinking was that years ago I met with some leading Christians in this country, and we decided to engage in interrogatory prayer to find out more about our Lord. And together we said, Lord, we'd love to know you better. Would you please share with us some of your own feelings? And we then made it quite specific. Is there anything that makes you feel sick? Which is an unusual question. And I'll never forget the moment my blood runs cold almost. Suddenly, from more than one person in that circle who were praying, just came one word: Christmas. And I think from that moment, I began to have serious thoughts about it. Now, there's nothing wrong with a family festival, nothing wrong with family reunions, nothing wrong with having a happy time together. And if that's the way you want to celebrate the cold, dark winter, do so. Don't make Jesus the excuse for it. That's my plea. Don't think that he's excited about it. How important it is for Christians not to think, what do the churches say or do, but what does Christ himself think or feel about it? Try asking him and see if he gives you the same answer he gave us on that occasion. But find out what his real thoughts are. Do you know that far fewer people are converted at Christmas than at any other time of the year? That's because most evangelists are not busy over Christmas. They're home with their families. And they find they can't get appointments over Christmas to hold a crusade. And so they seize the opportunity to have a bit of family life. There are fewer people. There are more people taking bread and wine at midnight communion, but far fewer coming to Christ. He has a very raw deal out of it all. I just leave that thought with you, because every Christian today must, I think, face up to the fact of Christmas. We can't get away from it. It's all around us. And we have to decide what we're going to do about it. Well, now, on the back of all that, let's go back to the Christian story of Christmas and look at it afresh. It's much more than in a school nativity play. And so I want to begin now, in this second talk, a look at the biblical Christmas. And you find it in the Gospels. And the story is an amazing mixture of natural and supernatural. And how seriously you take the supernatural part will have a big effect on how you celebrate Christmas. The natural part is really quite ordinary. There was nothing very different about the birth of Jesus, except for one feature. After some hours of pain and struggle, Mary brought forth her firstborn boy. That birth was quite normal, except for one feature. And I mention this because we're adults together. Her hymen, Mary's hymen, that protected her womb was pierced by a male from the inside, whereas in every other case, a hymen is pierced by a male from the outside. But that's the only difference I can find in the birth itself. It was not a miraculous birth. It was an ordinary birth after hours of labor and in not very nice circumstances. It wasn't in a stable, that's part of the myth. It wasn't in a cave. Though if you go to Bethlehem today, they'll show you a cave in the crypt of the big cathedral there, which they believe to be the cave where Jesus was born. They also show you a spot on the floor of the cave marked with a silver cross where Mary's milk was spilt. It's quite objectionable, the whole thing. He was born in an inn, but not in a room in the inn. There was no room in the inn, but he was still born in the inn. Because if you go to a Middle Eastern inn, even today, you have a big square wall with no windows in it, surrounding the inn, pierced by two big gates, or a big double gate at one side. And when you go in, you see rooms all around the inner side of the wall, and all the windows face inwards. And in the middle is a space with troughs for water and mangers for food for the animals. And all this is for security and safety in a dangerous world. You take your animals and your family into the gates, and then you ask, is there a room for us? And the clear biblical record is there wasn't a room available, which meant that they had to do what others had to do, and that is camp in the courtyard in the middle, where the only place to put a baby was one of the troughs. That's the picture. So Jesus was born under the stars, in the open air, in the courtyard of the inn. Do you see the picture now? Most Christmas cards have got it altogether wrong, either a stable or a cave or something. There's no word stable in your Bible. He was born where the animals were spending the night, and his family. It's a very ordinary story of taxes, poll taxes, and a pregnant fiancée of a young man. He was probably about 17 or 18, and she would be 15. That's the normal age for betrothal in those days. And there they are. Why are they so far from home? The answer is, she was pregnant before marriage. And that was in those days, as it still is in many circles, a disgraceful event. And she would be boycotted in her hometown of Nazareth. Nobody would help her. They wouldn't talk to her. They would just leave her alone. And so she had to give birth somewhere else. And since Joseph, her fiancé, had to go to Bethlehem for the poll tax because he belonged by his ancestry to that town, she had to go with him. And a 70-mile journey on a donkey is not a thing that a woman advanced in pregnancy would normally undertake. But she went. Now, it's amazing how many myths and legends have grown up around this birth. We had shepherds who came to see her. Well, there's nothing mythical about that. But then came wise men. And it simply says, wise men. But legend has said they weren't men, they were kings. They've even given them 3 names. And the origin of that whole thing is that they brought 3 gifts. And therefore it's thought there must have been 3 of them. And they must have been royal. Who else would come to a king? And they've been given the names. Well, all that's just not true. It's fiction. So you have this strange mixture of fact and fiction. And all the fiction isn't included. Many of Jesus' own cousins were assassinated because he was born in Bethlehem. King Herod was jealous, and he ordered the killing of every baby under 2 years to make sure that this baby born to be king of the Jews wouldn't survive. When did you last see that on a Christmas card? The soldiers of Herod slaughtering the babies. Must have been dozens of them, and most would be related to Jesus, because the people who'd come to Bethlehem to be taxed were all of the same extended family. Did you ever hear that preached about at Christmas? It's all part of the true story. But we select from the story what we like, and we then add to it anything that improves the story in our imagination. Oh, we even sing about it. Did you ever sing Away in a Manger? And about the baby that never cried? No crying he makes? Rubbish! The only way a baby can let its mother know that he's hungry is by crying. And to think that Jesus was so holy that he never cried. It's a ridiculous idea. But we've sung it heartily in children, or at least got our children to sing it. And whenever you see the picture of Jesus' birth, you see golden halos over the baby. It's a symbol of glory, but it was never seen by anyone. And Joseph and Mary. By the way, I have a real admiration for Joseph. Named after the Joseph of the Old Testament, he was a dreamer as well. And he got messages from God in dreams. And the first message he got was when he discovered that Mary was pregnant. He was horrified. And he even thought he'd have to break off the intended marriage and have a proper divorce from his fiancée, because betrothal was serious then. Well, Joseph believed the dream when God told him, I'm the father. And for the first time in history, such a thing. Fancy Joseph believing it. Yet he believed it. And the very next morning, he married Mary to cover up, even admitting or acknowledging that the baby was his at great personal cost. I love Joseph. He doesn't say much in the story, but he does an awful lot in response to dreams. We're going to have to stop there, have another break, come back, and we'll go on with this story in the next talk. Let's look at the facts of our Lord's birth. And the first fact is, he was not born in December. He was born somewhere around the end of September or the beginning of October. For the 7th month of the Jewish calendar bridges our September and October. And it was during that time that the Feast of Tabernacles was held. And it's quite clear from our Bibles that Jesus was born in the Feast of Tabernacles. How do we arrive at that? With a very simple bit of mathematics. 9 plus 6, which is 15. And with that simple sum, you now know when Jesus was born. We're told that his cousin John was born to Zechariah and Elizabeth. When Zechariah went into the temple and was told that his wife, who was way past childbearing, would have a son and should be called John. That was how John the Baptist began. Now when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her that she would have a son, even though she'd never known a man, he also said, and the proof will be that your cousin Elizabeth is also amazingly pregnant at her age. And immediately Mary set off to visit her cousin, who lived in a little village near Jerusalem. And when she went into the room, her cousin Elizabeth felt the baby inside her jump. The first time she'd felt that. And she said, my baby jumped for joy when you came into the room. And they shared what had happened. Now, it says that that was when Elizabeth was 6 months old, or 6 months gone. And 9 months later, Jesus was born. 6 plus 9 is 15. If we knew when Zechariah went into the temple and was told he was going to have a son, and add 15 months to it, we'd know when Jesus was born. Do you follow me? Well, from the book of Chronicles, the second book of Chronicles, we know in chapter 24 there is a list of the priests who had a rota to go and serve in the temple. And Zechariah's turn to serve is listed there. He was the 8th out of 24. And therefore, a third of the way through the year, Zechariah went into the temple. When you add the 15 to that, you come to the 7th month of the following year, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. And every Jew believes the Messiah will come at the Feast of Tabernacles. It's written in their scriptures, it's written in their culture. And so that's when they expected him. You find in the book of John that the Word of God became flesh and tabernacled among us. You also find out that Jesus' own brothers, who were skeptical of who he was, when the Feast of Tabernacles came round, later in John's Gospel, the brothers of Jesus said, it's the Feast of Tabernacles, you better go and show yourself in Jerusalem if you're the Messiah. And they were teasing him. They knew that the Feast of Tabernacles is when he should come. I'm also convinced that's when he will come again. I can't tell you the year, but I can tell you the month. It'll be in the 7th month. And that's when Jews all over Israel celebrate the future coming of the Messiah. And they have that in that month precisely for that reason. So he was born end of September, beginning of October. The biggest miracle in Jesus' birth was not the birth itself, though that's where the world focuses when they celebrate Christmas. The real miracle happened 9 months earlier. It was his conception that was supernatural, because Mary had never had a sexual relationship with a man. Now, that's not the only virgin birth there has been. A professor of gynecology in London University once told me that there have been probably half a dozen, 6 or 7, virgin births in the human race, recorded, claimed. But he said the one thing that convinced him that claims were possibly established was that in every single case, the result was a baby girl. And it would have to be a baby girl. The scientific process is called parthenogenesis, when a female egg spontaneously divides and produces an individual without having been fertilized. It's common in the vegetable world. It's not unknown in the animal world. The Komodo dragon is one species that has virgin births. And as I've said, there are records of it happening to humans, but never to produce a boy. So here undoubtedly is an amazing miracle. And there are three possibilities. We now know enough about conception and birth to know what could have happened. And there are three possible things that God could have done in Mary's womb. First, he could have created a complete initial fetus and planted that in Mary's womb. If that's what happened, then God was the father, but Mary would not have been the mother. She would not have contributed to the fetus. She would be a surrogate mother, nothing more than an incubator. So it can't be that. The second thing that could have happened, the only difference between a male and a female fetus is in one tiny chromosome. And in every cell in my body, that chromosome looks like the letter X. In my wife's body, every chromosome looks like a letter Y. And God could simply have added another little arm to the Y to make an X, to produce a baby, boy. Now, if that were the case, Mary would have been the mother, but God would hardly have been the father. Just a tiny bit of genetic modification, to use the term that's popular today. All that God needed to do was add that little limb to that tiny, tiny chromosome, and the result would have been a boy. The third possibility, the one I incline to, though I wouldn't be dogmatic on this, is that God created a male sperm bearing the DNA of divinity and fertilized one of Mary's eggs with his created sperm. That would mean that Mary was fully the mother and God was fully the father, and the resulting child would be human and divine together. So it's that third possibility that appeals to me. However, the miracle is that Mary produced a baby boy without the help of a man. That has never been heard of before or since. Let's go a little further. I've told you that I think Joseph must have been a fine young man to believe in a dream and act upon it. And in a second dream, he was warned about Herod and took Mary and the baby as refugees to Egypt, where no doubt they had to sell the gold, frankincense, and myrrh just to keep alive. And then later, when Herod died, they came back to Nazareth. So he only had 2 dreams. We don't have a single word that he ever said, but he acted on those 2 dreams. And to believe them and act on them must have taken tremendous faith. I'm looking forward to meeting Joseph. Now, Mary, Protestants say far too little about Mary. Again, the Roman Catholics have said far too much. And we have reacted against that. And we say far too little. I've heard so many sermons about other characters like Peter and Paul and John. Rarely heard a sermon about Mary, but she was the first charismatic. She was the first one to say, whatever the Holy Spirit wants to do with me, I'm willing. And she spoke in tongues on the day of Pentecost. I've never heard all that mentioned, have you? But it's there in your Bible. Mary was a most wonderful woman. And I enjoy preaching on Mary. And I've done so in in front of a bunch of 60 Roman Catholic priests, with a cardinal sitting in the middle of the front row. And my subject was what the Bible really says about Mary. I said it doesn't say anything about her immaculate conception or her perpetual virginity. She had more children, at least 7 of them after Jesus, or about her bodily assumption to heaven. And I went through the dogmas, the 4 dogmas that the Roman Catholics believe, and I said that none of them are in the Bible. But I said, you have discouraged us from preaching what is in the Bible about Mary, because you have added so many things that aren't in the Bible. One of which I'll come back to, a very important one. Now, as a human being, Jesus had a beginning. But when you write the story of Jesus, where do you begin? Mark said, I'll begin with his baptism, because that's when his public ministry began. Matthew said, no, you've got to go further back. You've got to begin with his birth, and you've got to trace his family history back to Abraham. Luke came along third and said, no, you've got to go further back than Abraham. You must go back to Adam, because Adam was the ancestor of Jesus. Finally, along came John and said, you're all wrong. Go back to the very beginning. And he took the words from Genesis 1, in the beginning, he already was. That word was is very significant. Not in the beginning he began, but in the beginning he was. Already there. And since the human mind can't go back beyond the beginning of all things, you just can't imagine when there was nothing, not even space. We can't imagine that. So you can't go further back. And what John is saying is, at the very beginning, he already was there. And he was face to face with God. And he was God. Of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses have had to change that in their Bibles. They don't accept Jesus' full divinity. But this means that Jesus' birth was unique, not in the way he was born, but in the fact that he chose to be born. Nobody else in the whole of history has ever chosen to be born as a baby. He voluntarily chose to be born. You didn't, I didn't. You didn't choose your parents, I didn't choose mine. We had no choice. But Jesus had, and he chose his parents and chose to be their baby. That's the most amazing thing, and yet I never hear it mentioned in any nativity play. Did you? I never saw it on a Christmas card. Love to see a Christmas card saying, the man who chose to be born. Now there's a truth for adults, not children, but for adults. Make you think. Well, now the problem that John had was, if he existed before his birth, even before his conception, what was he called? He only got the name Jesus after his birth. And he only got the title Christ when he became the Jewish Messiah. That's what it means. And he only got the name Lord after his resurrection and ascension. So what was our Lord Jesus Christ called? And John, with his inspiration of the Spirit, called him the Logos. That's the Greek for word, but it's much more than word. John was writing his gospel in Ephesus, where there was a man called Heraclitus. And Heraclitus was the father of modern science. And he taught his students to use their eyes to observe what went on and to find out the reason why things happened as they did. And the word for reason why is logos. And every branch of science has the word logos in it. Psychology, physiology, zoology, meteorology. Everyone is a study of how things behave in that field until you know the reason why it does it. So meteorology studies the weather and asks why the clouds come and drop rain, or why the wind goes this way, or why, the reason why. And that's the basis of all science. And John called Jesus the Logos because he's the reason why everything else behaves as it does. He's the reason why. Isn't that a lovely title? And so in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the ology of all our research and all our questions. He's the reason why. He's the answer. And then he wrote these amazing words. The Word, the Logos, became flesh and tabernacled among us, pitched his tent among us, lived among us. That word flesh is very important. I want to add 5 adjectives to it to bring across the sheer wonder of it. The Word, the Logos, the reason why, the second person of the Godhead who had always existed along with his Father, but chose to become a baby, took upon himself physical flesh. You could touch it. He could touch people. They could touch him. It was real physical flesh, such as you and I have. Secondly, it was male flesh, not female. I know Jesus has been claimed to be both male and female, and the most famous picture of him knocking at the door. Do you know that picture by Holman Hunt? Holman Hunt used 3 females as models for that picture. One for the long ginger hair, one for the face, and one for the figure. It's a thoroughly female Jesus in that picture, so I'm not too fond of it. Jesus was male. He came to show us God. And God is a father, not a mother. He's king of the universe, not the queen. He's husband of Israel, not the wife. And therefore, to show us God the Father, it had to be male flesh, whether we like it or not. Thirdly, it was Jewish flesh. He was born and circumcised as a Jew and is still Jewish. Yet most Sunday school pictures of him are of a Scandinavian with fair hair and blue eyes. That's not Jesus. He was Jewish with a Jewish nose. And he's still Jewish and always will be. And the next thing is, it was sexual flesh. There's been a kind of common impression that Jesus was sexless. If that's so, then he didn't have the problems that I have and that every male has. And he didn't overcome them, as he calls us to. It was sexual flesh. And in his teen years particularly, he must have had sexual temptations. There was a film recently that caused an outcry called The Last Temptation of Christ by a man called Scorsese. And it imagined that Jesus had sexual temptations. Well, that's true. He must have done. It was male sexual flesh. But he didn't give way to any of the temptations that brought. He overcame them. And finally, and this may be a shock to you, your New Testament says his flesh was sinful flesh. Now, we rebel against that. We think, no, he was without sin. Yes, he didn't sin, but he was made in the likeness of sinful flesh, which means he took on our fallen human nature and had that battle to face as we have to face. If it wasn't sinful flesh, then he hasn't fought our battles and can't give us the strength to. But he's been tempted in all points, like as we are. And the 3 points we're tempted are the world of flesh and the devil. And Jesus was tempted in all points, just as we are. Now that's a truth that many Christians can't accept. The Catholics have invented the Immaculate Conception of Mary to get round the problem. And they believe that Mary was born without sex or without sexual temptations. And therefore she was able to produce a boy who didn't have sinful flesh. But if Jesus was born of Mary, then our fallen nature was passed to him through Mary. And he had the battles we have, but he never gave in, and he won the battle. It's Paul who says he was born in the likeness of sinful flesh, Romans 8. And people say, just a moment. He says he was born in the likeness of sinful flesh. You mean just the appearance? No. The word likeness means exact reproduction. It's used in Philippians 2, where it says he took on himself the likeness of human flesh. And that really means he was reproduced as human flesh. And Paul says the same thing as sinful flesh. Now, my time has gone again. So I'm going to finish these 3 talks with this very direct question. Do you think it is appropriate to mix this pure Son of God with all that goes on at Christmas? With the office party, with the mistletoe, with all the rest of it, with the huge expense, with all the money that is spent, even on the children. Do you think it fitting to put Christ in the middle of that? The one thing that is certain is nobody is going to be able to abolish the sentiments of Christmas that come from its pagan origin. There have been so many attempts to clean up Christmas through the centuries that when you read the history of it, you realize it never succeeded. These things should not have been brought into the church. They should have been left outside. And people coming to Christ should be told, you leave these things behind. You don't bring them in with you. So we're left with that basic question. Do we want to mix Christ up with all that? And I'm afraid my answer is no, we don't. Let's rescue Christ from Christmas. Let's celebrate his birth when it really happened. It's much cheaper and simpler to do so. Let's separate Christ from all that is not of him. And let's worship him as he ought to be worshipped. That's my final word on Christmas. Thank you for listening.